The papers were already signed. Coplet Foster had filed for divorce, while his wife lay in a coma. Not separated, not estranged, comatose. Tubes in her wrist, machines breathing for her. And this man, dressed in a coat that cost more than most people's rent, walked into room 214 of Mercy General Hospital with a lawyer's envelope and zero remorse. He had actually done it, and he was going to get away with it. That was the plan. Anyway, until the nurse in the doorway raised a hand, looked him dead in the eyes, and said 7 words that made Coplet Foster, a man who had never flinched in a boardroom in his life, go completely, utterly still. 7 words that told him the woman he was trying to discard had known everything. 7 words that told him the people he trusted most had tried to kill her. 7 words that turned the most powerful man in that hospital into the most hunted. What did she say? Keep reading, because this is only where it begins. The pen was already in his hand when he walked in. Coplet hadn't slept, hadn't eaten, but none of that was guilt. It was impatience. The Hargrove merger closed Friday. $54 million, a new penthouse, and a fresh start with a woman who understood that business came before everything. All that stood between him and all of it, one signature from a woman who couldn't speak. He smoothed the divorce papers against the bedside table and clicked his pen. Carla Niles lay motionless, pale, still, heartbreakingly serene. Her hair spread across the pillow. The monitor beeped. The 4 dripped. She looked like she was simply waiting. She always did know how to make him feel like the villain. He thought. He reached for the papers. Mr. Foster. The nurse's voice came from the doorway, low, steady, and carrying the specific gravity of someone who had been watching and had decided she would no longer stay quiet. He toned. She stood with one hand raised, her expression unreadable, not angry, not afraid. Knowing. Before you touch those papers, she said, pulling a sealed evidence bag from her pocket, a phone visible inside. You need to hear what your wife recorded 3 minutes before her crash. Coplet's pen hit the floor, and the room, somehow, got colder. Subscribe to see how this unfolds, and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from. I will love to say hello to you, just to know how far our story is going. Coplet Foster had rehearsed this moment 14 times on the drive over. He'd mapped it out the way he mapped every high-stakes move, clinically, efficiently, without sentiment. Pull into the parking garage. Take the elevator to the 3rd floor. Walk to room 214. Place the papers on the table. Leave. 4 steps. Maybe 6 minutes total, if he stopped to sign the visitor log. He hadn't planned on feeling anything. And for the most part, as he pushed through the heavy glass doors of Mercy General and nodded past the front desk without making eye contact, he didn't. What he felt, if anything, was pressure. Not guilt. Pressure. The specific, suffocating weight of a man who had too much money on the line to afford the luxury of hesitation. The Hargrove merger closed Friday. $54 million. A restructured board. A new tower in downtown Chicago with his name etched above the 40th floor. Everything he had spent the last 11 years building was sitting at the finish line, waiting for him to cross it. And Carla, fragile, inconvenient, dangerously perceptive Carla, was the last obstacle standing between him and all of it. Not because she was fighting him. She couldn't fight anyone right now. She was unconscious. Had been for 19 days. But her name was still on everything. Her signature still on the joint asset accounts his new investors had flagged. Her presence, even horizontal, even silent, was enough to make the Hargrove family's attorneys nervous. And nervous attorneys asked questions, and questions were the one thing Coplet could not afford right now. So, the papers. He stepped off the elevator and moved down the corridor with the focused stride of a man who had somewhere more important to be. His overcoat swept past a nurse's station, past a family huddled in plastic chairs, past the quiet misery of a hospital floor doing its slow, solemn work. Room 214 was at the end of the hall. He pushed the door open without knocking. She's unconscious, he reminded himself. There's no one to knock for. The room was dim and cold and smelled of antiseptic and something faintly floral. Someone had left white lilies on the windowsill, though Coplet couldn't imagine who. He hadn't sent them. He hadn't sent anything. Carla lay exactly as she had the last time he'd visited, which had been 9 days ago, which had been only because his attorney said the optics required it. Pale, still, her blonde hair spread across the pillow with an almost theatrical softness, as though even unconscious, she understood how to present herself. The machines beeped, the four dripped. She looked, infuriatingly, like someone who was simply waiting. Coplet set the envelope on the bedside table and removed the papers with both hands, smoothing them flat. His attorney had been thorough, every clause airtight, every asset cleanly divided. Carla would be taken care of, financially. He wasn't a monster. He was just a man with a deadline. He uncapped his pen, turned to the signature line, and told himself one last time that this was the right thing, the only thing, that Carla had known, on some level, that this marriage had been over for years, that she would understand, eventually, once she woke up. If she woke up. The pen hovered. Sign. Walk out. Don't look at her face. Mr. Foster. He turned slowly, the way a man turns when he already senses that whatever is behind him is going to cost him something. The nurse stood in the doorway. She wasn't one of the ones he recognized from his last visit. She was taller, quieter, with a kind of stillness that didn't come from shyness but from choice. Her blue scrubs were pressed. Her stethoscope hung around her neck with practiced ease. One hand was raised, not dramatically, not accusingly, just raised. A single, unhurried gesture that somehow carried the authority of a courtroom. Her name tag read, Avance, Iron. I need you to wait, she said. Coplet almost smiled. I appreciate the concern, but this is a private matter between you and the woman in that bed. Nurse Vance's eyes didn't waver. I know. I've been her nurse for 19 days. She let that land. I know her vitals better than I know my own schedule. And I know that 3 hours before she was admitted, she came to this hospital. Coplet frowned. She was brought in by ambulance. After the crash. She came before the crash, Vance said simply, voluntarily, through the ER entrance. She asked to speak with the charge nurse on duty. She was frightened. A pause. She left something behind. The pen in Coplet's hand felt suddenly very heavy. What did she leave? Nurse Vance reached into the pocket of her scrubs and produced a sealed plastic evidence bag. Inside it, a phone, dark screen, a strip of medical tape across the back with 2 words written in Carla's looping handwriting, for Coplet. She said. Vance paused, as though choosing her next word with surgical precision. She said that if anything happened to her before she could get home, this was to be given to her husband. Another pause. She said she'd found something she called the secret file, and she was terrified of what would happen when the people who put it together realized she'd found it. The room felt smaller suddenly. The beeping of the heart monitor seemed louder. Coplet looked at the bag, then at his wife's still face, then back at the bag. What's on it? He asked, and his voice, to his own horror, came out quieter than he intended. I didn't open it, Vance said. It wasn't for me. She stepped forward and placed the bag on the table beside the divorce papers, directly beside them, deliberately, like a counter-argument. but I think you should listen to it before you make any decisions about those. Coplet didn't move for a long moment. The rational part of his brain, the part that had closed 17 deals in the last 4 years, the part that had learned to read a room and calculate risk before most people even found their seats, was telling him to pick up the divorce papers, put the pen away, and leave. Whatever was on that phone was not his problem. Whatever Carla had found, whatever she thought she knew, it was a paranoid spiral of a woman who had been suspicious of him for the last 2 years of their marriage, reading threats into every late meeting, every unanswered call. He was not responsible for her fears. He reached for the papers. She said your name, Van said quietly, on the recording, at the very end. She said, "Tell Coplet I'm sorry I didn't say it sooner." His hand stopped. He stood there, coat still on, pen still uncapped, and felt something move through his chest that he hadn't felt in a very long time. Something he couldn't immediately name because he'd spent years making sure he didn't have to. He picked up the evidence bag. Vance produced a small Bluetooth speaker from her station cart, the kind nurses use for patient comfort, and connected the phone without a word. She navigated to the voice memo folder. One file, 19 days old, 43 seconds long. She pressed play. Carla's voice filled the room. It was quieter than he remembered it, tighter, like she was speaking through clenched composure, but it was unmistakably hers. And in the first 4 seconds, Coplet Foster felt his entire world begin to tilt. If you're hearing this, then it happened. They found out I have the file. Coplet's jaw tightened. I've been documenting for 6 weeks. Wire transfers. Doctored liability reports. A payment. A sharp breath. A payment made to a man named Greer. I don't know his first name. I only know what the transfer note said. It said, Phase 2, Niles. And it was sent from a private account registered to Hargrove Capital. The word landed like a struck match. Hargrove, the merger, the 54 million, the family whose daughter, Priya Hargrove, Coplet had been privately planning to marry the moment this divorce was finalized. I didn't want to believe it, Carla continued, and her voice cracked just slightly at the edges. I kept thinking I was wrong. I kept thinking maybe I was just jealous, paranoid, whatever he always called me. But the numbers don't lie. Coplet, the numbers never lie. They're going to use you to take everything, and then they're going to get rid of you the same way they got rid of me. A pause. The sound of traffic in the background. She'd been in her car. Tell Coplet I'm sorry I didn't say it sooner. Then silence. Coplet realized he was gripping the edge of the bedside table. His knuckles had gone white. The divorce papers were still beneath his hand, but they felt, suddenly, like something he'd found in a stranger's coat. How long have you had this? He asked, and his voice was almost unrecognizable to himself. Since the night she was admitted, Vance said, I've been waiting for you to come back. He looked at Carla, really looked at her, for the first time in perhaps 2 years. She'd known. She had walked into this hospital, terrified, alone, already suspecting they were coming for her, and the first thing she'd thought to do was make sure he were protected. The woman he'd just tried to divorce. The woman he'd spent months calling a liability. She'd been trying to save him. He didn't leave. Instead, he sat, slowly, like a man whose legs had quietly made a decision before his mind caught up, in the chair beside Carla's bed. He set the papers on the floor. He did not pick up his pen. Nurse Vance gave him the room, stepping just outside the door with the practiced discretion of someone who understood the difference between privacy and abandonment. Coplet stared at the phone in the evidence bag and made himself think. Hargrove Capital. Phase 2. Niles. He pulled out his own phone, opened the encrypted drive his financial team used, and started cross-referencing the timeline Carla had described. 6 weeks of documentation. Wire transfers. It took him 11 minutes to find the first thread. A liability report for the merger, one he had signed off on 3 weeks ago, had been quietly amended after his review. A clause buried on page 41 that, if the merger closed, would transfer a controlling interest in his primary holding company to a blind trust registered in the Cayman Islands. A trust he didn't control. A trust that, when he traced the registration number through a contact at his bank, came back to one name, Preston Hargrove, Priya's father, the man who had introduced himself as a visionary, who had wined and dined Coplet's board, who had handed his daughter over with the ease of someone offering a gift, and who had, somewhere beneath the handshakes and the bourbon and the custom-tailored promises, engineered every single piece of this. The merger wasn't an opportunity. It was a trap, and Coplet had walked into it wearing a new engagement ring and carrying divorce papers, like a man too busy counting his future to notice the floor giving way beneath him. He thought about Priya. Her calm smile, the way she never asked questions about his business, but somehow always knew exactly what was happening inside it. The night she'd casually mentioned that Carla had been asking questions around the office. The night, he could see it now, that Priya had made a phone call she'd stepped outside to take. Phase 2. Niles. They hadn't just planned the merger around Carla. They had planned her accident around it. Coplet stood up so fast the chair scraped back, and Carla's heart monitor jumped a single, startled beat, as though even in a coma, she'd felt the shift in the room. He pressed his hands flat on the bed rail and looked at her face. They tried to kill you, he said. Not a question, not disbelief, just the raw, terrible weight of a fact that had finally landed with its full force. The machines beeped. She didn't answer, but she breathed, steadily, stubbornly, with the same quiet, immovable persistence that had driven him insane for 2 years and that he now recognized, with a clarity that felt like being doused in ice water, as the very thing that had kept her alive. He picked his phone back up. He had calls to make, evidence to secure, an attorney to contact, not the one on retainer for the merger. That office was almost certainly compromised, but his old college friend, Brennan, who ran a boutique litigation firm in Boston and owed him a favor from 2019. But first he did something he hadn't done in 19 days. He pulled the chair close to the bed. He sat down, and he said, quietly, to the woman who couldn't hear him, or perhaps could, in whatever dim and unreachable place she was resting, I'm not going anywhere. By midnight, Room 214 had become something it had never been before, a command center. Coplet had removed his overcoat, rolled up his sleeves, and spread a legal pad across the windowsill beside Carla's untouched lilies. His phone was at 40%. He'd eaten nothing. Brennan, now fully briefed, was already pulling corporate registry record from 3 states and had flagged the amended merger document as potential securities fraud. Nurse Vance had checked in twice. She hadn't asked him to leave. She hadn't commented on the legal pad or the phone calls or the quiet, controlled intensity radiating off a man who had walked into this room 2 hours ago ready to end his marriage, and was now dismantling a conspiracy from a chair beside his wife's bed. She'd simply asked if he needed water. He'd said yes. That was the extent of it. Around 1 in the morning, the floor grew quiet. The corridor outside settled into its nighttime rhythm, soft-soled shoes, the distant murmur of a monitor, the occasional squeak of a supply cart. Coplet sat in the low light and watched Carla breathe. He was terrified, not in the way he'd been terrified before big deals. That was adrenaline, the useful kind, the kind that sharpened him. This was different. This was a cold, creeping fear of a man who had just realized that the walls of the room he thought he controlled were, in fact, closing. Preston Hargrove was not a man who left loose ends. Carla had found the file. Carla had become a loose end. And now Coplet, who had spent the last 6 weeks being carefully positioned inside the trap, whose name was on every merger document, who could, if necessary, be made to look like the architect of all of it, Coplet had just become a loose end too. He looked at the door. The corridor beyond a small window in it was calm. A nurse passed. A janitor. Normal. But Coplet had spent enough years in rooms with dangerous men to know that dangerous men rarely announce themselves. They sent others. They waited. They chose their moments with the same patience that predators used. Not when you were alert, not when you were watching, but when you were finally, exhaustedly, asleep. He was not going to sleep. He pulled Carla's hand, gently, carefully, the way you handled something you'd almost thrown away, from beneath the sheet and held it in both of his. Her fingers were cold. Still, but her pulse, beneath his thumb at her wrist, was steady. She's still here, he told himself. She fought to stay here. The least he could do was fight back. He reached for his phone and typed a message to Brennan. Move the evidence filing to first thing tomorrow. And find out everything you can about a man named Greer. No first name. Connected to Hargrove Capital. Last known activity. 6 weeks ago. He sent it. Then he set the phone face down on the windowsill and turned back to his wife. The heart monitor beeped. The four dripped. Somewhere down the corridor, a door opened and closed. Coplet didn't look up. He kept his eyes on Carla's face. The stillness of it, the quiet, impossible strength of a woman who had walked into this hospital already knowing what was coming and chosen, anyway, to make sure the man who had stopped loving her was protected. He thought about that for a long time. He thought about all the meetings he'd taken instead of coming home. All the calls he hadn't returned. The year he'd looked at her across a dinner table and thought burden when the word he should have been reaching for, if he had been paying any attention at all, was shield. She hadn't been dragging him down. She'd been the only person in his life who was actually, genuinely, on his side, and he had handed her divorce papers while she was unconscious. The thought sat on his chest like something physical. He didn't push it away. He owed it to her to let it stay. Outside the room, the corridor remained quiet. But somewhere in the back of Coplet's mind, the part that had kept him alive through 17 years of corporate warfare, a low, persistent alarm had begun to sound. They knew where Carla was. They knew she hadn't died in the crash. And if Preston Hargrove was the kind of man who paid for Phase 2, then it was only a matter of time before he decided that an unconscious woman in a coma ward was a problem that still needed solving. Coplet straightened in his chair. He looked at the door. He wasn't leaving this room. Not tonight. Not tomorrow. Not until Carla Niles opened her eyes and he could look her in the face and say the thing he should have said 2 years ago, the thing that had gotten buried under ambition and ego and the slow, stupid blindness of a man who had confused motion with progress. He wasn't leaving, and God help anyone who walked through that door thinking otherwise. It was 12 minutes past 2 in the morning when Nurse Vance knocked. 3 short, deliberate taps, the kind that weren't asking permission so much as issuing a quiet warning. Coplet was already awake. He hadn't stopped being awake. She opened the door just enough to slide through and pulled it shut behind her with a careful click of someone who did not want the sound to carry. "There are 2 men at the front desk," she said. Her voice was low. Her face was composed in the way that experienced nurses compose themselves when the situation required calm, but the situation was not, in fact, calm. "They're asking for Carla's room number." She paused. "They're not family. They don't have credentials. And they're dressed like they flew in from a boardroom." Coplet was on his feet before she finished the sentence. He moved to the narrow window panel on the door and looked out into the corridor without touching the handle. 40 feet away, past the nurse's station, he could see the elevator bank. The numbers above the left elevator were climbing. 3rd floor. How long ago? He asked. 4 minutes. I stalled them at the desk. Told them visiting hours ended at 8 and that I'd need to verify their relationship to the patient before I could release any room information. A beat. One of them showed me a document. It looked official. Something about being medical representatives for a private insurance carrier. It's not real, Coplet said flatly. I know, Vance said, just as flatly. He looked at her. In the half-dark of the room, with his wife breathing quietly behind him and 2 men in suits ascending toward this floor, Coplet saw something in the nurse's expression that he hadn't fully registered before, not just competence, but resolve, the kind that didn't require an audience. I called the police 4 to 5 minutes ago, she said. He blinked. 4 to 5. When you started making calls and taking notes, and I recognized the name Hargrove from the business section of the Tribune. She folded her hands in front of her, unhurried. I've been Carla's nurse for 19 days, Mr. Foster. I read people. And that woman, she gestured toward the bed without looking away from him, came into this hospital scared for her life. I wasn't going to let the thing she was scared of walk through that door without making a call. The elevator chimed. Coplet turned back to the window. 2 men stepped into the corridor. Dark suits. No badges visible. One was heavy-set with a jaw like a cinder block. The other was lean and moved with the unhurried, economical stride of someone accustomed to walking into rooms and taking control of them. They stopped at the nurse's station. The overnight aide pointed, not toward room 214, Coplet noted with relief, but toward the charge nurse's office at the opposite end of the floor. Vance had briefed her well. How long for the police? Coplet asked. They said 12 minutes when I called. That was 9 minutes ago. 3 minutes. He looked at his wife, then at the door. Lock it, he said. The lock on a hospital room door was not, by design, meant to keep people out. It was a privacy latch, the kind a person could defeat with a flathead screwdriver or a determined shoulder. Coplet knew this. He wedged the visitor's chair beneath the handle anyway, because 3 minutes was 3 minutes, and he intended to use every second of it. He moved back to Carla's bedside. The heart monitor beat. The 4 dripped. Down the corridor, he could hear voices, low, professional, the sound of men who were very good at not sounding like what they were. Then a pause, then footsteps, moving this way. Coplet pulled his phone and sent Brennan a single message. They're here. Floor 3. Mercy General, Chicago. Tell the police room 214. He set the phone face up on the windowsill where the screen would be visible, stepped to the side of the door, not in front of it, but to the side, pressed flat against the wall the way every action movie had ever told him to, and the way his body, apparently, had been paying attention even when his brain insisted it wasn't. The footsteps stopped outside the room. A handle turned, found resistance, turned again, then a knock, sharp, businesslike, the knock of a man who was not accustomed to doors that didn't open for him. Hospital maintenance. We need to access the equipment in this room. Coplet said nothing. A longer pause. Then the second voice, quieter, speaking to someone not in the corridor. A phone call, barely audible. Coplet caught 3 words through the door. Confirm it's her? His jaw tightened. They weren't here for him. Not yet. They were here for Carla. To finish what the crash had started. To make it look like a complication, a monitor malfunction, and for irregularity, the kind of quiet, clinical tragedy that happened in hospitals and generated sympathy in closed files. Over his dead body, He looked at his wife. "Come on," he thought, with a ferocity that surprised him. "I need you to hold on for about 2 more minutes." The chair beneath the door handle shuddered. Someone was applying pressure from the other side, not a full shoulder charge. Not yet, but the exploratory force of a man testing a perimeter. Coplet grabbed a full stand, not as a weapon, not exactly, but as a something, a physical declaration of intent. He positioned himself directly in front of the door and waited with the stillness of a man who had made his decision and found, on the other side of it, an unexpected and unfamiliar quiet. Then, from somewhere below, muffled through 2 floors of concrete and linoleum, the unmistakable sound of a building front entrance opening. Multiple pairs of feet. Radios. The particular acoustic signature of law enforcement moving through a lobby with purpose. The pressure on the door handle stopped. A beat of silence, then rapid footsteps in the corridor, moving away from room 214. Coplet exhaled. He waited. 10 seconds. 20. He did not move the chair. Then Vance's voice, through the door. "Mr. Foster." "It's me." "They are running for the stairwell. The officers are behind them." He pulled the chair away and opened the door. The corridor was transformed. 2 uniformed officers sprinting toward the far stairwell door, another speaking rapidly into a radio at the nurse's station, and Van standing in the threshold looking precisely as unruffled as she had looked at 2 in the morning when this began, which Coplet found both admirable and slightly unnerving. "Are they going to catch them?" he asked. "The building is locked down," she said. "They are not going anywhere." He turned back to the room and stopped. The heart monitor was faster, not alarmingly, not the spike of a crisis, but faster, a rhythm that hadn't been there 60 seconds ago, a subtle but unmistakable acceleration that made every instinct Coplet had developed over the last 2 hours of sitting beside that bed snap to attention. He crossed the room in 4 steps. "Carla." Her fingers moved. It was small, a single fragile curl of the hand, the kind of movement that could have been dismissed as involuntary muscle activity, except that Coplet had been holding that hand on and off for hours, and he knew, with the specific certainty of a man who had been paying very close attention, that it hadn't moved like that before. "Carla." He took her hand. "I'm here. I'm right here." Vance was beside him in seconds, pen light out, leaning over the bed with the focused efficiency of someone shifting from witness to medical professional without breaking stride. She checked pupils, checked responsiveness. Her expression didn't change, but something in her posture shifted, a barely perceptible straightening, the physical equivalent of a held breath. "Carla, can you hear me? If you can hear me, squeeze my hand." A pause that lasted approximately 1 geological era. Then, pressure, faint, but real. "She's coming back," Vance said quietly. Not triumphant, just certain. Coplet's throat tightened in a way he didn't try to manage. It took 4 more minutes. The longest 4 minutes of his life, longer than any deal he'd ever sweated, longer than any boardroom silence he'd ever held. 4 minutes of watching Carla Niles climb back from wherever she'd been, hand over hand, through 19 days of dark and quiet and the kind of stillness that most people don't return from. Her eyes opened, slowly, then all at once. They were the same shade of dark brown he remembered, the color of strong coffee, warm and sharp simultaneously, and they found his face with a directness that hit him somewhere between the sternum and the conscience. She looked at him for a long moment. Then, in a voice that was barely a whisper, cracked from 19 days of disuse, she said, "You're still here." It wasn't a question. It was something closer to disbelief. "Yeah," he said, and his voice, to his profound lack of dignity, was not entirely steady. "I'm still here." Her eyes moved slowly around the room, the machines, the full, the window, taking inventory the way someone did when they were reconstructing reality from scratch. Then they came back to him, and something sharpened in them. Memory, returning in pieces. "The file," she said. "I know," he said. "I found it." Hargrove. "I know. Carla. Brennan has everything. The police are here." Her brow contracted. They came. They came. They didn't get in." She closed her eyes for a moment. When she opened them again, there was something new in her expression, something that looked, through the exhaustion and the pale fragility of 19 days in a hospital bed, remarkably like relief. "There's a drive," she said. "A physical drive. Everything is on it. The transfers, the Greer contracts, the original liability report before they amended it." She paused to gather breath. "I put it in the lining of my winter coat. The gray one. It's an hour. It's in the coat closet. At the house." Couplet was already texting Brennan. "Get it before they do," Carla said. "Already done," he said, and hit send. She watched him, and then, in the quiet that followed, the beeping of the monitor marking time like a patient witness, she said something he hadn't expected. "I heard you," she said softly. "Earlier, when you said you weren't going anywhere." He looked up from the phone. "I don't know if it was real or if I was dreaming," she continued, "but I heard you, and I thought," she exhaled, slow and careful, "I thought that's a good reason to come back." Couplet Foster, who had spent 17 years ensuring that no room, no person, and no circumstance could make him feel genuinely small, looked at his wife's face and felt every constructed wall he'd spent a decade building do something irreversible and long overdue. He sat down beside her. He didn't speak for a moment. Then, "I'm sorry, Carla." And he meant it in the way that men who rarely mean things finally mean something. Completely, without qualification. "I'm sorry for all of it." She held his gaze. She didn't tell him it was fine. She didn't tell him she forgave him. She didn't do any of the things that would have made it easier for him. She just nodded, once, slowly, the nod of a woman who had heard him and was deciding what to do with what she'd heard. It was more than he deserved. He knew that. He'd take it. By 4:30 in the morning, the lobby of Mercy General Hospital looked nothing like a lobby. It looked like the closing scene of a federal case. 2 of Chicago PD's finest had intercepted the men in suits, a pair of contract operatives named Greer and Whitfield, both with records in 3 states and both, as it turned out, already on a watch list connected to 2 other corporate accidents over the past 18 months, in the parking stairwell between the 2nd and 3rd floor. They hadn't gone quietly. It hadn't mattered. Brennan had called in a favor with a contact at the FBI's Financial Crimes Division at 3:15, and by 4, a federal warrant had been issued for the records of Hargrove Capital. By 4:45, Preston Hargrove himself was being escorted out of his Gold Coast penthouse by 2 agents in windbreakers, his silver hair immaculate even at this hour, his expression the particular marble-cold fury of a man who had never genuinely believed he could be touched. Couplet watched the footage from Brennan's phone, a shaky, second-hand video from a news van that had somehow already materialized outside the Hargrove building, standing in the corridor outside room 214 while Vance monitored Carla's vitals inside. He watched Preston Hargrove duck into the back of a federal vehicle and felt, rather than satisfaction, something quieter and more lasting. Accountability, the kind that didn't require him to do anything except have been in the right room at the right time with the right woman who had, despite every reason not to, decided to protect him anyway. Priya Hargrove, he learned by 6 in the morning, from Brennan, had already retained counsel and was cooperating with investigators in exchange for a reduced charge. She had confirmed the timeline. She had confirmed her father's instruction to have Carla removed as a liability before the merger closed. She had confirmed, without apparent remorse but with loyal precision, the existence of Phase 2. Coplet read the summary Brennan sent and felt nothing in particular about Priya. She had been a strategy. He understood that now. A human instrument deployed by a careful man to get close enough to the target to neutralize the one person standing in his way. What he felt, mostly, was tired. The good kind of tired. The kind that comes after something is finally, completely over. He pushed the door to room 214 open and stepped back inside. Carla was awake. She had been moved to a slightly elevated position, pillows behind her, the bed raised, and was holding a small cup of water that Vance had brought. She looked fragile in the way that someone looks fragile when they've just spent 19 days surviving something that should have killed them, and strong in the way that same person looks strong when it becomes clear that it, in fact, did not. She looked up when he came in. "It's done," he said. She considered that. Hargrove. Arrested. Both of them. He moved to the chair, then stopped, looked at the windowsill. The divorce papers were still there, the envelope slightly crumpled now, the papers inside unfolded, sitting where he'd left them when everything changed. He crossed to the windowsill. He picked them up. He didn't think about it. He just started tearing. The papers separated cleanly at first, then in rough, satisfying strips, the crisp legal language, the notarized seals, the signature line with its 2 blank spaces, one of which Carla had never been conscious to refuse. He tore until there was nothing left but confetti in his hands, and then he let it fall into the small hospital wastebasket beside the window with the quiet finality of a man who was done making the worst decisions of his life. He turned around. Carla was watching him. Her expression was unreadable in the way that her expressions had always been unreadable to him when she was thinking several things at once and hadn't decided yet which one she wanted him to see. Then she extended her hand. "Give me the rest," she said. He frowned. "There isn't any rest." "The envelope," she said. "Give it to me." He picked up the torn envelope from the windowsill and crossed to the bed and placed it in her hand. She looked at it for a moment. Then she set it carefully on the bedside table, the same bedside table where he'd laid the papers 6 hours ago with the intention of walking out of her life, and folded her hands in her lap and looked at him with the dark, steady eyes of a woman who had earned the right to say whatever she was about to say. "You tore up the papers," she said. "Yes." "That doesn't put them back together. Coplet." He held her gaze. "I know. I heard you say you weren't leaving." A pause. "But you were leaving. You had been leaving for 2 years. You had already left. You'd just forgotten to file the paperwork." She said it without anger, which somehow made it heavier. And one night in a hospital chair doesn't change 2 years. "I know," he said again. "I'm not forgiving you tonight. I'm not asking you to." She studied him, really studied him, the way she used to in the early years when she was deciding whether to trust something he'd said, with the careful, unsentimental attention of a woman who had learned, at some cost, not to take things at face value. "Then what are you asking?" she said. He thought about that. He thought about what he'd realized in that chair at 1 a.m, watching her breathe, watching the monitor chart the stubborn, steady insistence of her heart. He thought about the word shield. He thought about 19 days of absence and 6 hours of finally, irrevocably being here. "Time," he said. "I'm asking for time. To do it differently. To be different." He exhaled. "I know I don't deserve it. I know you have every reason to hand me those papers back and find the worst divorce attorney in Illinois and take everything I own." "A beat. I'm asking anyway." Carla looked at the torn envelope on the table, then at him. The heart monitor beat. The room was quiet in the way that rooms get quiet after everything important has already been said, and what remains is a space between people deciding who they are going to be next. "You have a lot to prove," she said finally. "I know. And I have a lot of healing to do." She looked down at her hands, the foreline, the slight tremor in her fingers, the evidence of 19 days her body was only beginning to account for. "I'm not the same person I was before the crash. Couplet. Whatever we were, I'm not going back to that." "Neither am I," he said. She looked up, and for the first time since she'd opened her eyes, something shifted in her expression. Not forgiveness, not yet, not even close, but something that existed in the neighborhood of possibility. The faint, tentative opening of a door that hadn't been permanently locked. "Sit down," she said. "He's Saturday." Vance appeared in the doorway a moment later, checked the monitor readings, and made a note on her chart. She looked at Coplet, then at Carla, and whatever she saw in the arrangement of the two of them, the chair pulled close to the bed, the torn papers in the wastebasket, the particular quality of the silence, seemed to satisfy some private assessment she'd been running since 2 days into this vigil. She made no comment. She simply nodded once, in the quiet, decided way of someone who had done what she came to do, and pulled the door gently shut behind her. Outside, Chicago was beginning to lighten, the first gray suggestion of morning pressing itself against the window. The city waking up to a day that would carry, in its news feeds and its courthouse records and its federal case files, the wreckage of Preston Hargrove's careful empire. And in room 214, in the pale early light, Couplet Foster sat beside his wife's bed and did not reach for his phone, did not check his messages, did not calculate the next move or the quarter's margin or the damage to the merger that would need to be managed by morning. He Saturday. He watched her rest. He thought about what it meant to actually see someone, not as an asset or liability, not as a convenience or a complication, but as a person, a whole, complete, irreplaceable person who had loved him long past the point where love was easy and had tried, even at the cost of her own safety, to protect him from his own blind ambition. He had a lot to prove. He knew that, but for the first time in a very long time, Couplet Foster was exactly where he was supposed to be, doing exactly what the moment required. Staying. And that's where we leave them, not with a fairy tale, but with something more honest than that, a beginning that knows how much work it has ahead of it. If this story moved you, hit that subscribe button so you never miss what comes next. Drop a comment and tell me where in the world you're watching from. I genuinely want to say hello to every single one of you, because you are the reason this story kept going. See you in the next one.